Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Through the Ages, a new story of civilization. This is a revised version of the classic Through the Ages that came out back in 2006. In this one, they've tweaked some of the cards, streamlined some of the rules, so it's definitely the same game, but it's got a different vibe and feel to it in certain places. This is a lengthy, in-depth Euro game where you are building a civilization by drafting cards from a row and getting a really big engine going while also trying to keep your military might on par with all of your opponents. CGE was kind enough to give me a review copy of the game, so I will show you how the game plays and then I'll jump into my review. Before I begin, I want you to know that I'm not going to do a comprehensive rules overview of the game. I'm just going to touch on the main concepts so you have an idea of how the game plays, and I'll try to also touch on the ways that this version is different than the last one. If you do want to see a wonderful comprehensive video to see how every aspect of this game plays, Paul Grogan at Gaming Rules Videos has made one, and I'll put the link down below. Each player has a board like this in front of them, and it might look something like this once you are a couple turns into the game. The first thing you might have noticed on this board are these two sets of colored cubes that are on your board. We have the yellow bank and the blue bank, and depending on where these cubes are on the board, they depict different things. When a yellow cube is down here, it represents potential future population. You could also think about it as the amount of land that you've conquered. Right now, you've conquered very little land, so your civilization is quite small. When a yellow cube is here in your worker pool, it is a piece of population that could potentially be used to make something. And when a yellow cube is up on any of these cards up here, it represents one of that type of building or unit. So this cube right here is a warrior, and this one right here is a farm. The blue cubes represent resources, and depending where they are on your board, they will be different things. These two blue cubes are both food, and these three over here are bronze, because these are at the mine and these are at the farms. And you'll know that this is worth one food because this card right here has a 1 and then a bag underneath it, and same with all three of these right here, they are each 1 bronze. The last of the cubes are these white and red ones, and these represent the number of actions that you can take on your turn. The 4 white cubes are your 4 civil actions, and the 2 red cubes are your 2 military actions. And you start with those because, as you can see, we are all despots, and you see the 4 white and the 2 red. This game centers completely around these actions here. Most of the things you're going to do in the game require civil actions, but if you do militaristic things, you're going to have to spend these military actions. So, on a turn, you're going to have, at this point in the game, 4 civil actions and 2 military actions to do. Once you have done all of those that you want in a myriad of different ways, you would pass and the next person would take their turn. The first thing any good civilization needs to do in order to be successful is to have a bigger population. So you can make people out of this yellow bank by spending a civil action and then bringing this cube up. You'll notice that there is this 2 and a bag down here, which means it costs 2 food to make this cube. We look up here, we already know that we have these 2 blue cubes, which each represent 1 food. When you spend them, they go right back to your bank, and now you have a worker in your worker pool, which you can use to build new things. But wait a minute, you have a leader. His name is Moses, and you'll see that underneath him he says you increase your population, costs you 1 food less. So in that case, one of these food actually stays in your bank, so this leader was able to let you make population for a bit cheaper. Now that you have a worker in your worker pool, you should use them. So we can go ahead and spend another civil action, and we can build a philosophy. We can bring this up to here, and if we look on here, there is a 3 and then a little ore symbol. That means it costs 3 ore in order to build a philosophy. So all 3 of these are ore. We can put those back down into our bank, and we have now turned that person into another building of philosophy. You notice down at the bottom, there is this little light bulb symbol and a 1. That means that on every turn, each of these philosophy cubes will generate 1 science for this civilization. If we look at the science track, we can see that we are green and we already have 4 science in the bank, but we were only making 1 science turn before because we only had that 1 philosophy. Well, we just built another one, which means this would slide over to here, and now at the end of every turn, I'll be making 2 science, which will accrue on here, and I will spend on technologies later. It's important to know that I won't be able to build a 3rd philosophy, and the reason for that is I have an urban building limit which is associated with my government. You see this little 2 down here? That means I can have a maximum of 2 of these yellow cubes in any stack of a urban building, which are these gray ones. It's a big reason why you'd want to upgrade your government into later versions. But let's say you want to do something slightly different. Instead of building this philosophy, you want to work on your technology within your system and leave this worker right here. So we can bring these 3 ore back, and instead we can spend this civil action in order to build this technology, which is called alchemy. We can see that it costs 4 science up in the top left corner, and then we're going to play it down right here, and you'll see this symbol of a little vial matches the one on the board, so you're going to kind of splay them up. This means that alchemy is the upgraded version of philosophy. And we can do that because we had 4 science at the time, so we'll go ahead and spend all of it.
And now that we've invested in alchemy, we should use it so we can spend another civil action, and now we can upgrade a previous building into a new version because we have developed it. We could of course just build an alchemy. It costs 6 ore, but we only have 3 ore. In order to do an upgrade action, you look at the difference between the 2 ore costs. In this case, it's 3, and then you spend that difference, 3 ore, and you pull the cube up. Now, if you notice, there is a 2 in a light bulb down here. That means that this single cube represents 2 science, which means that we've not used this cube down here, so we're getting the same amount of science now at the end of a turn, 2, but we're using 1 less cube to do it. But hold on a second, there's one more type of card that you have in your hand. It is a yellow action card. We see it says Urban Growth, build or upgrade an urban building, pay 1 or less. That means instead of doing what we just did, we could spend this card as a one-time use, send it out of the game, and when we did this upgrade, it would have only cost us 2 ore instead of the 3, so we have 1 left over in our bronze area. It's now time to show you how I got those cards into the hand. You'll notice we have 1 civil action left currently. Up here we have the card row. These were all dealt out randomly, and you'll see the cost for them is in civil actions on the bottom. These all cost 1, these right here cost 2, and then these to the right cost 3. As they are taken from the board, they will filter down so they'll get cheaper as time goes on, and some of them will get burned from the left-hand side if nobody takes them anyway. So that means with our single civil action here, we could grab any of these cards. The first one is a wonder. It is purple, it's the Hanging Gardens, and if you look down here, you'll see these 3 2s and then an ore symbol. That means it's going to cost 6 ore in order to make this. However, it takes 3 stages to build. So each one of these 2s is going to cost a civil action. So 3 civil actions and 6 ore, that's quite a bit, but it would get us a single culture at the end of every turn and 2 happiness. Now, culture is the way you win the game. The person with the most culture at the end of the game wins, so getting 1 every turn is not bad, and I'll discuss happiness in just a second. When you grab wonders, they come into your player area tilted to the side. At least this is the way I do it to show that it's not built yet. And then as you're building it, you are going to spend the civil actions to do these stages. And when you build a stage, you take 1 of the ore and you put it down to cover up that spot so you see how close you are to finishing that specific wonder. We have a yellow card here. This one's really simple. It just says get 2 science immediately and then get 2 culture, which is victory points. But it's important to note that when you take action cards into your hand, you're never allowed to play them on the same turn. Although I wouldn't really care. I only have 1 civil action left over anyway. Now we've got a printing press, which is a new type of urban building. It is a library. We see this book symbol in the top right corner. That means if we were able to develop this technology, it would cost 3. We would actually put it over to the side. It is a new type. We only begin with laboratories and religion, but a library, well, that's new. And you'll see at the bottom that each cube on here would get us a culture and a science. So it's a little less good at making a science, but it gets you victory points, which is of course how you win the game. Green cards are leaders. We know that because we have Moses here already in our area. The issue is that leaders will die as the ages go along, and the ones that come out as the game goes on are also better than the old ones. So Leonardo da Vinci here, I'm not going to go into the specifics of what he does. I could just tell you he's good at making science, and you can bring him into your hand, and later on you can essentially upgrade out of Moses and put Leonardo da Vinci into play. And this is the difference between the new version and the old one. When you upgrade a leader, so you get rid of one, you actually get the civil action back, which is a nice bonus to try and incentivize you to cycle through leaders a little more. And the last one that we can afford at the moment is monarchy. This is a new type of government. Remember, we are despots at the moment, and we can see that it would cost 8 science in order to build this, which is quite a bit. You'll also notice this little 2 number down here. What that means is you could go into a revolution instead of doing a peaceful governmental change. You can just spend your 2 science, but you'll lose the rest of your civil actions for the rest of your turn. You could just do military stuff because it's a military revolution. You might have problems because of it, but it's a really good way to upgrade your government if you don't have a lot of science around. And the reason you want to upgrade is, as before I said, that there's that urban building limit that you can only have 2 in your labs. Well, now you see this has a 3, so you can build 3 laboratories. That's nice. But also, you now get 3 military actions and 5 civil actions. So it's an upgrade of 1 to 1 on each, and the more things you can do on your turn is usually the better. We can't actually afford it at the moment because it costs 2 civil actions, but I do want to point out these blue technology cards. It's pretty obvious you spend the science that's in the top left corner to get their benefit, but these are not buildings. You never put yellow cubes on top of them. They are just an ongoing benefit that you get as the game goes on. This one adds 1 to your military strength, and it's going to gain you another military action that you can use every turn for the rest of the game. So why not? Let's just say I spent this 1 civil action grabbing the Hanging Gardens and putting it into my area. At this point, we just have these 2 military actions left over, and unfortunately only 1 ore. If we happened to have had a single another ore, we could spend a military action in order to spend both of those ore, turning this person from the worker pool into another warrior, because as you can see, it's got a little red symbol as opposed to these kind of whitish ones, so you know it's a red military action you need to spend, and it costs 2 ore to do that. And each person in this area is going to give you 1 military. So at the beginning of the game, you only have 1 military power, but if I was able to put another one down here, I would then be at 2. I'll discuss military at greater length in a little bit, however. The first thing we do is discard our excess military cards. Now there are hand limits for the 2 different types of cards in the game. These civil cards, which we just talked about on that card row that cost these civil actions, you can only have as many in your hand as you have civil actions, so 4 at this point in the game for me. And then there are military cards, which I'll explain in just a minute, and you can only have as many of those as you have military actions. So right now, I have 2, so I'd have to discard down to 2, and it's important to note, this is a subtle difference between this version and the old one. In the old one, you had to discard at the beginning of your turn, and this one you discard at the end, which is nice. Next up, we have the production phase, but it's important to note that it says you skip this during an uprising, and this is where happiness comes into effect. You are in an uprising if your population is too unhappy. This is the happiness symbol right here, and if we had not built this religion, for instance, and our happiness was down here at 0, because you notice that religion gave us 1 happiness, we now have an issue. We have a gap here where there are no yellow cubes and there is not a happiness marker covering them up. That means that the population is going to be in an uprising. However, if you have any workers who are currently not being tasked to do anything, well, you can kind of mark them that they are discontent by putting them down here on a spot where the happiness should have been. And for the moment, you can keep doing your stuff as you can do your production phase and everything. You're not in an uprising, they're just discontent. But if you put this person to work, for instance, over here as a warrior, then everybody's too unhappy and you're not going to produce any of this stuff. So it's pretty obvious that you never ever want to find yourself in an uprising. It's just a super bad idea. And it means that as you make more population, you're going to have to follow it by increasing everybody's happiness. So the first part of the production phase is scoring your science and culture. To do this, we look at the track and see how much science we're making a turn. Right now it's +2 because we got that 1 alchemy. So that means we generate 2 science, which we can use later. And then we look at the culture and we see we're making +1 culture because of that single religion that we have that's also giving a happiness. Well, that gets us 1 culture, and once again, culture is victory points. You want to have the most of these to win the game. Now we check for corruption. We look to the blue bank, and if we see any negative numbers, that means we're going to lose some stuff. And that's going to happen if you have too many blue cubes that are not used at the end of your turn. You'll see there's a -2 right here, and then over here there is actually a -4 and eventually a -6. So it gets really painful, and the idea is that you have to use the resources you make, or else it'll just kind of disappear out of your warehouses due to bureaucracy and overall corruption. So you want to use these cubes, and in this case, I would immediately have lost these 2 ore due to that -2 corruption. But that wasn't actually where we were at. We are not suffering corruption because we used our cubes well. Now we produce food, which means that every cube in this food production area is going to make 1 blue cube for it. So there are 2 cubes here. That means we take 2 blue cubes and put them into the agriculture. So each of these yellow guys is making us 1 food a turn. Now we look at food consumption, and we see that we actually have a -4 culture penalty for every food we can't spend, so you really don't want to do that. And we look down here and we see this -1 food bag. That means as you are making more population, you'll see that the consumption is going to go up from -2 to -3 and even higher. So at the moment, we were only at -1, so we would lose that 1 food. And that also means that we're effectively making 1 food a turn right now because we made 2 but lost 1. And lastly, we have resource production, which is just like making food. Every single yellow cube in our ore making area is going to get an ore. Now we draw military cards, and we get 1 for every unused military action. So this right here is the military card deck, and you take them blind from the top, and then only you get to take a look at them and see what they do. And I'm going to briefly cover these in just a minute. And finally, we reset our actions so that we can spend them on the next turn. I know that that was a pretty in-depth overview of how the production phase worked, but it is really important to know that because that is how the engine you are building actually runs. I'm going to briefly explain all these different types of cards that are in that military deck. These top 2 are a little bit different than the rest of them. This is an event and this is a territory, but they both work very similarly. At the beginning of every turn, everybody gets 1 political action, which can be starting an aggression, starting a war, or seeding an event. And both of these are effectively events. When you do that, you're going to put one of these into a face-down pile, and then you will evaluate a randomly shuffled event that is in a current pile and do what it says, like This one right here says the weakest civilization loses 1 population. So what ends up happening is once that current pile of events goes away, then the pile that you put this into gets shuffled, and then that becomes a new pile. So by putting an event in, you're saying that at some point in the future, that event will evaluate, not right at the moment. And when a territory pops up from the event stacks, then there is going to be a bit of an auction where people will sacrifice military power in order to get a territory like this into their area, which is going to give them an immediate bonus, like this is just 3 science, and then an ongoing bonus. This would get them an extra yellow cube and an extra blue cube for their 2 respective banks. So next up is the Defense Colonize card. You can either discard it in order to get 1 colonize bonus in that auction where you are sacrificing units in order to develop a territory. Well, this adds +1, so that's nice. Or you could discard it to add +2 to your military strength when you're defending yourself against somebody else's aggression. Next up, we have these blue cards, which are pacts. These are agreements between 2 players, and they both get some sort of benefit usually. This one right here lets 1 player spend food as ore, and the other person can spend ore as food. Now we have a tactic. So this is a bit interesting. You spend 1 military action in the middle of your turn in order to put this into play. And what it does is it's a bit of set collection. It means that for every single soldier unit you have and cavalry unit you have, you're going to get a bonus of 2 military for just having both of those 2 types. So this is one way to really boost up your military. Next up are aggressions, and they also cost red military actions. However, they also consume your single political action at the beginning of your turn. And what you do is you target one of your opponents who has less military strength than you do, and they need to defend themselves, or else this bad stuff at the bottom is going to happen to them. In order to defend themselves, they can discard cards like this one, which adds +2 to their defense. But this is a pretty big difference between this version and the old one. They could also discard any other card, any other military card they have in their hand to add +1 to their defense value, and ties go to the defender. Another big difference between this version and the old one is in the old one you could sacrifice units to double the military value coming from them, but sacrificing is completely off the table in this game. All the defender can do is discard cards from the military hand to make up for the difference. And finally, we have wars, which come out later in the game. It takes an entire turn for it to evaluate, and then at the end of that, whoever is up is going to take damages from the person who is low. So that means you could start a war and then lose it and lose a bunch of stuff. Here is the military board, and for example, I could be at 3 military and my opponent is only at 1, but now we have these tactics cards I just mentioned. When they're played, they go into this area and you put your banner on top of it to show that it is currently yours, and that means, like I said, for every soldier type I have and every horse type I have, I'm going to get +2 military. So if I had 1 of each of these, I would get 2 extra power. If I had 2 soldier types and 2 horse types, I would get another 2 bonus military, which is really important. This is a pretty big difference between this game and the previous version, however. In this one, your opponents can learn the same tactics that you are using. They have to wait a full turn, and then they can spend 2 red military actions in order to copy you, essentially. They saw you guys doing this cool medieval army thing, and they want to do the same thing. Once every card from the Age 1 stack goes through the card row, you are going to move on to Age 2. Once you go through all the Age 2, you go to Age 3, and once you go through all the Age 3 cards, the game will be over. You will calculate all your victory points, and whoever has the most is going to win. There are many fine points and smaller mechanics that I have not covered here, but I hope that this has given you a pretty good idea of how the game plays. So now it's time to review Through the Ages, A New Story of Civilization. I actually reviewed the classic Through the Ages a couple of years ago, and so some of these points that I'll be talking about will be very similar to the ones in my previous video, but some of them will speak specifically to the differences between this revised version and the classic version. So let's start with the positive points, and the first of these has to do with how satisfying each turn is while you're playing the game. Right at the beginning of the game, you have 4 civil actions to play with, and there's all sorts of things you can do. You can create population, you can turn that population into buildings, you can upgrade one building into another perhaps, you can make military units, but most importantly, you are going to be wanting to draft those cards from that centralized row into your hand to use as the game goes on, because this is how you get new pieces for your engine into your system. But the problem is that oftentimes you'll have like 4 or 5 actions worth of stuff to do in your own little board here. Maybe cards you've already drafted on previous turns. Maybe you really need to make 2 population to use up all that food you have banked up so you don't go into corruption, and you'll kind of have all that planned out, and then you realize there's a card on the main row that you just have got to have. It maybe costs 2 civil actions, and now you need to think,
what is worth those 2 civil actions to me to not do on my player board? Maybe I don't make those extra people and I don't use that food, and maybe I corrupt now. That's going to cost me a couple ore, but that card is so good, maybe it's worth losing that ore. And these are all just the many great decisions that you have to think about while you're actually playing the game in each one of your turns. And I found that you almost always end your turn passing it to the next player, feeling like you did something good and progressive for your civilization in front of you, and I just love how each of these turns feels. Positive number 2 has to do with the great balance between the 2 engines of the game. One is militarization, getting a really big military to be the strongest person around the table so that you can potentially aggress or do wars, but more importantly, just threaten this action against players. They might make pacts with you where you can't attack them, but they just give you resources or victory points. And more importantly, those events that are coming out all throughout the game, many of them have to do with the person who's strongest getting a benefit and the person who's weakest not getting a benefit. So there's a really good reason to have some militarization engine going. The flip side is you have a victory point engine that you can make instead, where you might just get a bunch of libraries and theaters and get maybe a leader who fits in really well with that, and you can get an explosion of victory points that you're getting every single turn. But if you are really going hard on that, your military will likely be very weak. And so I love that you have both of these things to do in the game, and the game incentivizes you to do both of them. And certain players will be a little more militaristic, other players will be a little more victory point engine heavy, and that has a little bit to do with how the cards come out on the card row. Maybe someone gets a little more lucky, the cards that fit for a specific combo just come out for them. But if that happens to that one player, they get a really good engine going, there is the incentive for the other players in the game to make military, to spend their ore instead of trying to catch up on a victory point engine and being worse than this person who got the stuff they needed. Well, no, instead they should throw that ore into making a big military and start to beat them down with those events. It's kind of a passive-aggressive situation where they're not actually attacking the other person, they're just making sure the other person is weakest. But if they get a really big military advantage, well then start throwing aggressions down and squeezing victory points or science, all sorts of stuff out of that player who maybe went too greedy. Since you definitely don't want to just go with your victory point engine. The game is all about having enough military. If you want a big victory point engine, you are probably never going to be the strongest, and you are essentially saying, I'm okay with losing the events, my engine is good enough, but you never want to be so bad that people start beating you down with those aggressions. So it's just got a great checks and balances system between those two engines that you are constantly fluctuating a little bit back and forth between, and it comes together really well in the game. Positive number 3 relates to the comparison between this new revised version and the classic Through the Ages when looking at the militarization. My only issue with the original game of Through the Ages was that in the late game, military could be too punishing. There were too many ways to suddenly skyrocket up, like double or even triple your military might in just a single turn, and the other players have no way to combat that, and then they just get destroyed by wars and aggressions in that late game, and this wonderful engine that they building all of the game long just lies in rubble, and they feel like, wow, they spent so much time putting this together, and it's disheartening and not fun. And it seems like they took a very targeted approach to trying to fix this with a revised version in 3 different ways. The first way is they eliminated sacrificing units when you are doing aggressions. So if you remember or not, in the original version of the game, you would commit a certain number of your military units to just die straight off the bat to essentially double their military value. And the problem was that if you're a defender and you do that and you just barely defend, well, they are gone and they're no longer adding to your military value, and the next time it comes around the table, you are even weaker, and you become weaker and weaker the more you get attacked and more you sacrifice units. They just eliminated that entirely from the game, and they switched it up with allowing you to discard any number of these military cards in your hand to add +1 to your defense. So it's, in general, easier for the defender to defend because any card can add +1, and you don't need to worry about your opponent sacrificing units to have just this overwhelming thing going on. Also, it's less to think about. There's less number crunching of, okay, well, if I sacrifice this much plus that one tactic, then I'm going to be here, and where are they at, and how much are they going to do? You just eliminate all that by not having to worry about the sacrificing. The second thing that they did is they made it so that you can share tactics. That was another big problem, was that this wonderful Euro game with very little randomness had this one splinter in the side where you could just never draw a tactic card, or the only tactics card you draw, you just are never able to fulfill based on the technologies that come out in the row. And because of that, you might want to militarize. You're like, I'm not trying to be greedy with my victory point engine here, but I was never given the option to militarize up, and now I'm just getting destroyed by this crazy military. Well, in the revised version, you can share those tactics with your opponents. I mean, you don't have to, in fact, you don't really want to, but the game forces you to. When you play a tactic down, you get it for 1 round, nobody can touch it, but then after that, people can use that tactic as well. It costs a little bit more military actions, but it makes thematic sense because you can see your opponent, you know, up on their horses, and you're like, hey, we should do 2 horses together as well. That's a good idea. But it also just helps mitigate the luck of the draw. If somebody gets a really good tactic, they play it, well, other people can jump in as well. They pay a little bit more for it, but it makes a lot of sense. And the last thing is they eliminated the Holy War, which might seem a little silly to talk about a single card in this massive game in this review section, but this was single-handedly the worst aspect to the over-militarization, because if you had this crazy military and they played this card, you could destroy tons of buildings from your opponent, just rip their engine apart. And in this revised version, they just eliminated that card at all. I think they realized that this is an engine building game. You don't want to destroy your opponent's engine. You could still take tons of their victory points, like the culture war is still there, and it still makes a lot of sense to do those wars if you have the option. So it's not like they made it necessarily nicer, it's just you don't mess with a person's engine, you just steal a bunch of stuff that the engine made, and I think that is a much better way to approach it. Positive number 4 is also a comparison between the old version and the revised version, specifically when talking about the aesthetic appeal of the game when it's on the table. The original game worked, but it was pretty boring to look at when you look at the cards and the player boards and everything. But this new version is just gorgeous. You have wonderful illustrations on every one of the cards. The player areas just make more sense. I just love the look of the game so much more when you're looking at the table itself. With all of the events and the territories and everything, all these cards have their own individual artwork, and I think that brings a lot to the overall immersion and feeling of being in the Civ game, because unlike most Civ games, there is no map, so I think having it just be a card game, it's good that they focused on making those cards look a lot better. And now for positive number 5, which is also a comparison between the old and the new version. And this relates to the production cycle of the game. Now this is the upkeep phase of your turn. Your turn is essentially over. You pass it to the next player. They are going to start doing their stuff. And now you need to upkeep your little kingdom. You are going to make your food, then you're going to consume your food. Then you're going to make ore and check for consumption. And there's a whole bunch of little kind of fiddly things where you're going to be moving bits around on your player board. With the old style, you had to do quite a bit of thinking to figure out if you were going to corrupt or not. And corruption is a big deal because it takes away your ore, and ore is how you make everything. So you don't want to corrupt. And so a big problem with the old game, with the original version, was that you had to spend a lot of time thinking and making sure you were not going to go into corruption because it was not obvious. What they've done with this new version is they switched things around. Before you used to produce and then see if you corrupted, now you check to see if you corrupt before you move any pieces on your board. So there's no thinking at all. You just look down at any point in your turn, really, you just look down and see, am I in corruption at this point? No. Okay, I move on, instead of having to think more about it. And that tiny little change of checking for corruption before you produce versus after, really, it helps the downtime of the game. It streamlines your turns. It's a fiddly, awkward thing that you used to have to really pay attention to that was not particularly fun. It was just necessary. They eliminated that. It's like they killed a piece of homework that was added into every single aspect of your turn, and I just love that change. It's still a little fiddly, moving all these little bits around your board, you know, setting them up here, bringing them down here, moving them to the different cards, but man, the production phase is so much better in this new version. Alright, so now let's shift into a couple neutral points, and the first of these relates to analysis paralysis. Now this is the idea that there might be so many things to think about and how they interlock together that you might freeze up and have a hard time figuring out what you actually want to do. And unfortunately, that still is a factor in this game. It is still an action point kind of system where you might have like 6, 7, 8 different civil actions and so many things that you could do. You could maybe take this card and upgrade that and do this and make some military, or maybe I don't care about military this turn, maybe I do this card instead, and I play this one and I grab this leader, and oh my goodness, there can be spots mid to late game where there are lots of good options for you, and it can bog down a little bit, especially if you have somebody who really insists on getting the absolute best turn. So what I found myself doing when I play this game, especially if I'm playing it around the table as opposed to being online, I just go with the first good answer that I find. Like, I'm looking, trying to figure out a good turn. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm not corrupting. I progressed my stuff. I was able to upgrade a thing. I'm going to just do that, pass my turn, and not think about the fact that there was probably actually a better turn out there. But for the sake of the game and my sanity and everybody else's, to not like get kind of bored waiting for me to come up with that perfect turn, let's just move on. This one's good enough. And it's just something that you should know if you or the people you play with have a propensity for analysis paralysis. This game definitely triggers it, but I think you could argue the flip side that the great decisions that you have in your turn and the stuff that you're doing on your turn can make that heavy analysis worth it. So this leads me directly into neutral point number 2, which is that this game is still quite long, and that's something that you just need to understand when going in. Now, different players are going to play differently. I've heard about some people saying, oh, I could play a 2-player game in under 2 hours when I see it on the internet, and I say, well, that's great, but my experience is that the last time I played a 2-player game where I knew the game and I was teaching it to a new player, it took well over 3 hours because that was a new player. And the last time I played a 3-player game where we all were very experienced with the game, like we all have way over 10 plays, it still took almost 4 hours for those 3 players. And that is just, I think, me and my friend group. Some people play this game faster, some people play it slower. I think I tend to get bogged down in analysis paralysis a little bit, and so downtime can definitely become a thing when I'm playing it with my friends. But the flip side is, it never feels that long. Like that 4-hour game with my 3 friends, it felt like a 2-hour game because it was just going and there's so many things. You're so engaged. The game is so wonderful that it's almost like you go into a bit of a time warp. Like time is moving faster around you as you're doing this game, and then it ends and you look at the clock and you are in disbelief that it just took 4 hours to play that 3-player game. So this is just a bit of a word of caution that this is a wonderful, in-depth Euro game, but in my experience, it takes well over an hour, maybe like an hour, hour and a half per player to get this game done, even once you really know what you're doing. But I would also argue that it's totally worth the time that you spend on it. We've reached the point in the review where I would usually discuss negative points to the game, issues that I just could not get over that I think really do bring the game down, but I have none. The only one I had with the classic game was that over-militarization, and like I said earlier, I think this revised version fixes it, so I have no negative things to say about this game, so let's move on. Now let's go into the replayability of this revised version of Through the Ages, and I think that it's above average, which is kind of interesting because you see every card in the game when you are playing this game. Like that's the whole idea of the game. You shuffle up that deck and you go through that entire deck. Now, you might miss a couple of the cards in the Antiquity deck, which will change things slightly if like Aristotle or the Pyramids don't come out in that one given game. That will change the tune of that early game a little bit, but for the most part, this game plays the same every single time you play it. But the way those cards are shuffled and the way they come out in the row and the order in which they do that will have huge ramifications on how you play this one game you're in right now versus the one you play next time. In one game, you might have no problem getting like iron or coal and getting a really big ore production. And in the next game, you might just have no ore production at all. In fact, from an actual example, the last game I just played, I ended the game with 4 bronze. I was never able to get iron, coal, or oil, and I did not do very well in that game. I actually came in second, which kind of blew my mind. But in that game, production was not a big deal to me, and instead, well, it was a big deal that I couldn't do it, but instead of having the options to go for that, I had to do other things. And the fact that the game forces you to try other things, to try and do the best you can with the cards that are on the row when it's your turn, really increases the replayability of this game. So I have no problem with that aspect to it. And also I think just the depth of play, the way that the more you play, the better you get at it, really increases the replayability of this game. I've played the original game like 18 or 19 times. I played this revised version of the game about 6 times now, and I don't really see that cooling off. So now let's go into the various player counts that the game supports. It is a 2 to 4 player game, and I'm actually going to talk about this with respect to playing the game on the table in the cardboard form and playing the game online. So I think that the 3-player game is best for when you are sitting down at a table to play the game because you have the great interaction between the players. You have the ability for 2 people to maybe trying to gang up on one person who has an amazing victory point engine going on, and it keeps the downtime low-ish because there's only 3 of you around the table. But I think the game plays best at 4 players, but I will very rarely, in fact, probably almost never play that in real life with 4 players because downtime really is just too much of a thing, and at least for the people in my group, that is going to be like a 6+ hour game, which in general, I would rather play a couple games in that amount of time instead of just one, even if it is a brilliant, wonderful game like Through the Ages. So if you're playing online where you might have a whole day to take your turn and it takes a month to actually play the whole game, I think playing 4-player is best. You get the most interaction, the least amount of cards are burned, you have the ability for maybe one person to go big military and one person to go engine, and the different interplay around those is great because if you don't want to go big military, maybe you just make sure you're not the weakest. You're not the strongest, but that's okay. You're not getting pummeled, but you're still trying to do your own things. There's a lot of great interaction there. But all that aside, this game is great 2 players, and that is a difference between the new Story of Civilization, this revised version, and the old one. Because in the old one, 2-player didn't really work because of that over-militarization in the endgame. One player would just get really big, potentially, usually, and just destroy the other person, and it was kind of a game of who can have the crazy military escalation first. And in this revised version, the way they've changed the military around, they've kind of tamed it down and streamlined all that stuff, it definitely works. You no longer have to worry about a holy war coming through and destroying all your buildings. Maybe you have a great engine coming through and they do steal a bunch of your victory points, but that's okay because maybe your engine is just good enough that you can afford to lose those points and still win. It's a solid two-player game now, and I have no problem playing it 2 players, but you know, it's hard to say. This game is brilliant at all these player counts. I hope that the differences between these is not going to sway you or dissuade you in any way. In conclusion, I feel like I won the board gaming jackpot. It's almost like CGE came to my door and said, hey, remember that board game that's your favorite one ever but that you had a couple problems with? Well, we spent a few years and analyzed hundreds of thousands of online games of it to balance out the cards that were really bad, made them a little better. The cards that were too good, we made them a little bit worse. We looked at that big problem that you had with that over-militarization, and we fixed that for you. Also, we kind of streamlined the production. I know you didn't really complain about that, but that was a problem, and we decided to fix that for you as well. So here is a much better version of your favorite game ever, and I just want to pinch myself. This game is completely brilliant, and I could not ask for more. It is, I think, it's a game that you should own if you like medium to heavyweight games. The only person who I think should not play this game is somebody who does not like any game that plays for more than an hour, hour and a half. And even for those people, I would say, you know what, you owe it to yourself to try at least maybe the 2-player version of this game once. Just dedicate like 4 hours and give it a shot, because what you will probably notice is that that clock is going to go by way faster than you thought. You're going to feel like the minute hand is spinning on your hand because the way you play this game, you go into a time warp, and the fun and satisfaction that you get from playing this game completely makes the amount of time it takes to play worth it. So, in conclusion, I strongly, completely, wholeheartedly recommend anybody who's even remotely interested in this game to check it out. And also, to people who like the old version but have not played this new version, I think that this is a must-get. The changes that they've made make that game that was amazing even more amazing. I think you owe it to yourself to own this new version if you like the original Through the Ages. It's amazing. If you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to my channel. Also, you can directly support the channel at patreon.com/JonGetsGames. Thanks for watching.